I never would have noticed the door if the note wasn't pinned right next to it. Under no circumstances. Open this door. The handwriting was rushed, almost jagged, like whoever wrote it didn't have time to think it through. At first, I thought it was a joke. The building was ancient, full of creaking floorboards and random quirks, and maybe someone thought it'd be funny to mess with a new guy. But as I stared at that note, something about it made my stomach tighten. That wasn't a prankster's handwriting. It looked desperate. The door itself was barely noticeable, almost blending into the dark wood paneling of the office. If you didn't look closely, you'd think it was just part of the wall, and yet it felt like it was staring back at me. That night, after everyone had left, I stayed behind to finish unpacking. The office had a heavy silence to it, the kind that presses on your ears when you're alone in a place you don't know well. I had almost forgotten about the door until I heard it. A low, faint sound, like a vibration, coming from the wall. At first, I thought it was the heating pipes, but it wasn't rhythmic. It was too deliberate. I moved closer, pressing my ear against the cold surface. The sound stopped the second I made contact. My skin prickled, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if I was hearing the silence or if something else was listening. The second night was worse. I'd been trying to ignore the door, but it felt like it was pulling at the edge of my awareness, even when I wasn't looking at it. I stayed late again, partly to finish some reports, partly because I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to watch it. Around midnight, just as I was about to pack up, the noise started again. It wasn't just a vibration this time. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping. It didn't sound like pipes or anything mechanical. It sounded human, like knuckles on wood. The taps came in pairs, perfectly synced with my breathing. My hand froze on my keyboard, and I swear, the moment I held my breath, the tapping stopped too. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. I couldn't let go of the idea that something was behind that door, something that knew I was there. Against every instinct screaming at me to stop, I walked toward it. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt, like the room itself was resisting me. When I was just a few steps away, I reached out and touched the handle. It was freezing, almost burning against my palm. Then, as if to taunt me, the tapping started again, this time louder. I yanked my hand back, heart pounding, and turned to leave. But before I made it to the door of the office, I heard something new. A low whisper coming from just behind the door. My name. The whisper had my legs rooted to the floor. It wasn't like someone was calling me from inside the room. It sounded more like the word was being pulled through the cracks in the door, stretched and warped until it barely resembled my name. I felt dizzy, like the room was tilting, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I don't remember deciding to leave, but suddenly I was outside in the hallway, clutching my bag and fumbling with the elevator button like my life depended on it. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. The sound of my name still echoed in my head, distorted and wrong, as if my thoughts were haunted by it. The next day, I told myself I'd imagined it. Long hours in a creepy old building. Anyone would start to lose their grip a little. But when I got to my desk, there was something new. A small notebook sitting squarely in the middle of my workspace. It wasn't mine, and nobody had mentioned leaving it there. The cover was faded leather, and when I opened it, I saw handwriting that looked just as frantic as the note pinned next to the door. Most of it was gibberish. Words scratched out, rambling sentences about it watching and never looking too long. But one line stood out, circled so many times it had torn the paper underneath. It only opens for those who listen. That phrase stuck with me all day. It only opens for those who listen. What did that even mean? Was this some elaborate prank to scare the new hire? It didn't feel like one. Every time I glanced at the door, I felt like the shadows around it were deeper than the rest of the room, like it was drawing the dim light into itself. The idea of listening made me uneasy too. I hadn't touched the door again, but I started catching myself holding my breath, straining to hear something. It was like I wanted to prove there was nothing there, but a part of me already knew there was. That night, I worked late again. I didn't want to, but deadlines were piling up. The office was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes every little sound seem amplified. A creak of the floorboard, the hum of my computer, and then, as if it had been waiting for me to let my guard down, the tapping started again. It wasn't tentative this time. It was harder, faster, almost impatient. My stomach twisted into knots. I told myself not to look, not to react, but I couldn't help it. My head turned toward the door. The tapping stopped immediately. I froze, staring, and then it hit me. There was no space for someone to be standing on the other side. The door was flush against the wall. Whatever was knocking, it wasn't in the next room. It was inside the wall itself. I backed away from the door slowly, trying to convince myself that what I just thought didn't make sense. The wall couldn't have someone inside it. This building was old, yes, but it wasn't some kind of haunted mansion. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. But the thought wouldn't leave me alone. If the knocks were inside the wall, then where were they coming from? My head felt like it was spinning, and I almost left right then. But something stopped me, a deep vibration that rippled through the floor. It wasn't loud, but I could feel it in my chest, like standing next to a bass speaker. My eyes darted to the door. It wasn't tapping anymore. It was pulsing. I moved closer, almost without realizing it. I wanted to scream at myself to stop, but the pull was stronger. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle again, the metal so cold it numbed my fingers. This time, I twisted it. I half expected it to stay locked, but instead, it gave a sharp click, and the door creaked open just an inch. My breath caught in my throat as I stared into the sliver of darkness beyond. It wasn't just dark, it was void, an empty blackness that seemed to suck in the light from the office. The air that seeped out was freezing and smelled faintly metallic like blood. I didn't dare push the door open any further, but before I could pull it shut, something moved. A flicker of a shadow. So quick I wasn't sure I'd really seen it, but it made every nerve in my body scream to run. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. For a second, I just stood there gripping the handle, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The room was dead silent again, but the tension in the air hadn't gone away. If anything, it was worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. My eyes darted around the office, scanning the shadows in the corners and under the desk, half expecting something to be standing there, watching. But the room looked normal, at least as normal as it could with that door still looming in the corner. I forced myself to lock the door. The old keyhole made a grating, metallic noise as I twisted the handle back into place. My fingers shook so badly, I almost dropped my keys. As I stepped away, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Faint smudges on the wall around the frame. They were handprints. Small. Too small to be an adult's, and they were smeared, like whoever made them had been clawing at the edges of the door. My stomach churned. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the elevator, leaving the lights on and the door behind me. But just before the elevator doors closed, I thought I heard it again, a faint knock echoing softly down the hallway. When I got home that night, I locked every door and window in my apartment, double-checking them like a paranoid maniac. But no amount of locks could stop the unease that followed me. I couldn't get the handprints out of my mind. The size of them, the way they were smeared like someone had been desperate. I tried to convince myself they'd been there all along, and I just hadn't noticed. But that didn't explain the knocking, or the shadow, or the smell of blood. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept imagining the sound of those rhythmic taps, matching my breathing, waiting for me to listen again. The next day, I dreaded going back to the office, but I couldn't avoid it without raising questions. The second I walked in, I could tell something was off. The air felt heavier, colder. My desk was exactly how I'd left it, except for one thing. The notebook was gone. In its place was a folded piece of paper, stained yellow at the edges like it had been sitting in some damp corner for decades. My chest tightened as I picked it up and unfolded it. It wasn't a new message. It was the same one that had been pinned next to the door on the first day. Under no circumstances, open this door. Only this time, there was something scrawled beneath it in shaky letters. You listened. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I stared at the note. That word, listened, was burned into my brain. What did it mean? I hadn't done anything except press my ear to the door. My stomach dropped as I realized what the notebook had said. It only opens for those who listen. Did I trigger something just by listening? The thought made me feel sick. I shoved the note into my desk drawer, not wanting to look at it anymore, and tried to focus on work. But the room felt different now, charged with a tension I couldn't ignore. The day dragged on, and nothing happened until the office emptied out for the night. I had told myself I'd leave on time, but deadlines kept piling up, and before I knew it, I was the only one left. As the hours ticked by, the oppressive silence started to weigh on me again. At some point, I realized I wasn't just hearing silence anymore. There was a sound soft, faint, and so low I could barely make it out. It wasn't tapping this time. It was breathing, slow and shallow, like someone standing just a few feet away. My skin crawled as I turned toward the door, and for the first time, I saw the handle move. It didn't turn completely, just a small, deliberate twitch like someone testing it from the other side. I froze, my eyes locked on the handle. It moved again, a slow, deliberate twist that made my stomach churn. Whatever was on the other side wasn't just knocking or whispering anymore. It was trying to get out. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. It was like my body was caught in some invisible grip, forcing me to stay and watch. The handle stopped, and for a moment, nothing happened. I started to think maybe I'd imagined it, that my nerves were playing tricks on me. Then I heard it, a voice, low and gravelly, so quiet it felt like it was speaking directly into my mind. You shouldn't have listened. The words broke whatever hold had been keeping me still. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my chair, and bolted for the door to the office. I didn't even bother turning off the lights. The hallway felt impossibly long as I sprinted toward the elevator, my heart pounding like a drum in my ears. I slammed the button over and over, praying the elevator would come faster. Behind me, the air seemed to shift, growing colder and heavier. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it. Something was there, waiting, watching. When the elevator doors finally opened, I threw myself inside and hit the ground floor button so hard I thought I'd break it. When I got to the ground floor, I didn't even look back. I burst out of the building into the freezing night air, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I kept walking, almost running, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that door. It wasn't until I reached my apartment that I realized my hands were still shaking. Every instinct told me not to go back, to quit my job, burn the place down. Anything to avoid whatever I'd unleashed. But what scared me most wasn't the door. It was that voice. The way it had spoken to me, like it knew me, like it had been waiting for me. The next morning, I debated calling in sick, but curiosity and a weird sense of guilt got the better of me. When I walked into my office, the first thing I noticed was how wrong it felt. The desk wasn't in the same place I'd left it. Neither were the chairs. Even the framed picture on the wall was slightly crooked, like the entire room had been nudged while I was gone. But what sent chills down my spine was the door. The note was gone. In its place, scrawled directly onto the wall in that same jagged handwriting, were 3 words. You opened it. The words on the wall sent a jolt of terror through me. I backed away from the door, but no matter how far I moved, it felt like it was looming closer. I didn't open it. I thought desperately. I hadn't even seen what was inside, just that sliver of darkness. But the door didn't seem to care about technicalities. My breathing hitched as I noticed something else. The handprints were back. But this time, they weren't smudged or faint. They were darker, clearer, and more numerous, spreading outward from the frame like something, or someone, had clawed its way free. I grabbed my things, determined to leave and never come back. But as I turned toward the hallway, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a text from an unknown number. It's open now. My chest tightened, and my hands fumbled as I tried to turn off the phone, but it buzzed again. Another message appeared. Don't look behind you. My blood ran cold. I didn't want to look, but the feeling of something breathing down my neck was impossible to ignore. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at me to run, I turned around. The door was open, just a crack, and from the darkness, I swore I saw something move. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted out of the office, leaving everything behind. My bag, my phone, even my keys. The elevator felt like it was taking forever, so I ran down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet. Every step, I expected to hear something chasing me, but there was only silence. The kind of silence that wraps around you and smothers every sound. When I finally made it outside, I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street. I looked back once, just once, and through the office window I saw it. The door was wide open now, and the shadows inside seemed to spill out into the room, darker than the night outside. I never went back. I called my boss the next morning, made up some excuse, and quit on the spot. They didn't seem surprised. Maybe they'd had other employees who'd seen what I saw. Maybe they knew more than they were letting on. I don't know. What I do know is that it didn't end there. A few days later, I started hearing it again, tapping, soft and deliberate, coming from the walls of my apartment. Last night, I found a new note on my bedroom door. Just 3 words scrawled in that same jagged handwriting. You let it out.